So we now get to the model. And here is Henk. We met in 1992 when I came to the Netherlands for the first time to work. And we had a meeting very early on and realized that our interests were very much overlapping. And we, in those days, had more time, it seemed. We spent a whole day just discussing bereavement and grief and coping and sharing ideas. Henk had just recently done his PhD on grief and bereavement, and I had just, with my husband at that time, had conducted the Tübingen study of bereavement, which was a longitudinal study with widows and widowers and married men and women as controls. So we had a lot to share, really, our different empirical studies. And that got us thinking about coping. And this is what came out. Next slide, please. This. Fortunately, we didn't rub it out before photographing it. But you can actually see this was the work of a long day. We got very excited, as you can probably tell. And it's got the fundamental points of our dual process model. You've got loss and restoration. You've got chronic grief. You've got trauma down at the bottom and delayed. And you've got coping, and you can even see a bit of a mess, a zigzag perhaps, in the middle. So that was the first version. And finally, it became the following. Next slide, please. Here we are, dual process model of coping with bereavement, looking a little bit more presentable. So let me just go over this briefly. This is our way that we feel people cope in the context of everyday life experience. I think that's important to note. This is taking into account the fact that you need time off, that it's exhausting. People do other things, they have to do other things. But within everyday life experience and social context and everything that we do in our normal daily lives, we experience coping with grief, both loss-oriented and restoration-oriented. These are the two types of stressor that we have to deal with. Under loss-oriented coping, we have grief work, intrusion of grief, and we have letting go or continuing, relocating bonds and ties. And while we're doing this, there's the avoidance or denial of restoration changes, for the simple reason that while you're thinking about one thing, you can't think about another. But this can change very rapidly, or you can be dwelling on your loss for a long time. It can change over time, of course. But at other times, we reckon that you are restoration oriented. Now, it's important to note that this word does not mean having been restored. This is an active coping focus. We're dealing with stressors here. We're just dealing with different types of stressors. We're attending to life changes, learning to dress the children for school if your wife had done that and she died, doing new things that you've never done before, perhaps learning to give talks online, distraction from grief. It takes time off from thinking about the person, him or herself. It's perhaps involving denial or avoidance of grief. And finally, very important, you have to develop new roles, identities, and relationships. These don't happen overnight. They don't happen very early on in grief, probably. But over time, you have to consider new ways of going about meeting new people, perhaps, or taking on a new job. Maybe moving house and having to develop new relationships with new neighbors and so on. So these things are also stressful. They also have to be dealt with. The finances, for example, may be very stressful indeed if you've lost the income of a partner and have to take on the job in order to make ends meet, pay debts, perhaps. So these two types of stressor necessitate what is perhaps the most original aspect of the model, and that is what we call oscillation, which is an emotion regulation process. So you oscillate between doing the one to doing the other, doing everyday life experience. That basically is what the model is all about. It looks simple, but the implications, I think, are quite complex. And in the meantime, we're actually writing a book about it and putting together the work that we have done, the publications we've done since we first developed this model, and the work of others, many others who've joined us in the effort to really refine, think about, and develop the model and look into its implications and applications.